Metroid 2: Return of Samus is the second game in the Metroid franchise that was released on the original Game Boy in November 1991. This is the game that every Nintendo and Metroid fan is familiar with. But what if I told you there was a mysterious image depicting a remake that may or may not be real? In April of 1998, the official Nintendo magazine of Germany, called Club Nintendo, featured an article highlighting the Game Boy Color, which would release internationally in November of the same year. While the article itself does not mention Metroid at all, the image to the left of the text displays a Game Boy Color with a mysterious image of Metroid 2 on it in full color. This image would imply that Metroid 2 was planned on being remade in color, to be released on the Game Boy Color in a similar fashion to Link's Awakening and Link's Awakening DX. This is where the mystery largely begins, because the origin of this screenshot is completely unknown. No one can tell for certain if it was part of an early build for the game or simply a mock-up that the magazine made itself, just to showcase the color capabilities of the new handheld. One theory is that this could have been a new area created specifically for the remake, similar to how the color dungeons were created specifically for the remake of Link's Awakening, because this room does not appear anywhere in the original Metroid 2. Prime Blue, who originally scanned this image for the Metroid database, also claims that this magazine rarely produced mock-up screenshots, because it seems unlikely that a magazine company would go through the trouble of creating a completely new image when they could have simply recolored an old one. Though at the same time, Captain Commando, also from the Metroid database, thinks that the rotation and position of the image on the Game Boy seems as though it could be a mock-up. So no one's really sure. It could go either way with whether or not this is real or fake. While Metroid 2 DX has been speculated to exist for a long time, the game was never listed as in development in Nintendo Power, and in a translated interview with Yoshio Sakamoto from the Metroid database, he said this about why there was no Metroid games on the Game Boy Color. As for the Game Boy Color, it would have been similar to the design of the Famicom, and so would have been unfavorably compared to the Super Famicom version. Meaning that had there been a Metroid game for the Game Boy Color, it would have looked too similar to the NES version, which was outdated to Super Metroid on the SNES at that time. Additionally, Yoshio Sakamoto has been known to enjoy creating new projects rather than remaking old ones, which would have been the case in a Metroid 2 remake on the Game Boy Color in the form of Metroid 2 DX. There have been claims that Metroid 2 DX was officially announced in 1999, however I have not been able to find any official source that can confirm this. There have also been claims that Dan Osen from Nintendo said Metroid DX's color palette was fitted to work well with the Game Boy Color. However, this is most likely a misinterpretation of another interview from the Metroid database, where Dan Osen says, "I think they were able to put a special Metroid palette in the GBC hardware. This makes Metroid 2 look really nice on the Game Boy Color." Game Boy Colors were backwards compatible with original Game Boy games. Metroid 2 was released on the original Game Boy, so most likely he's referring to if you play Metroid 2 on a Game Boy Color, it'll look nicer than had you played it on the original system. In my opinion, it seems like nothing more than a mock-up, mostly just because of how scarce the details are. If it had actually existed in some developmental form, I'm sure there would have been more information about it floating around the internet by now, especially outside of a German magazine scan of all things. And if this game had actually been in development at one point, it had to have been a case of Metroid Dread, where it was so early on that the idea had only been written down on paper. It's also curious to note that this article was published in the April issue of the magazine. There have been a lot of April Fool's Day hoaxes in American gaming magazines before, so when it's believed that April Fool's Day actually originated from Germany in the 1500s, maybe this was a quiet prank that was never blatantly admitted to being fake? Who's to say, but it certainly does raise a lot of mystery surrounding yet another rumored Metroid game. Want to learn about another rumored Metroid game that's even more interesting than Metroid 2 DX? Click the annotation to take you to my Metroid Dread video.